It's really good to see you all, and I hope you'll find what I have to say this evening interesting, informative. I hope you'll find it somewhat disconcerting, because what on earth is a vicar doing standing here talking to you about money, for goodness sake? Well, I'm the kind of person who likes making connections between things. And when I gave up my day job, as it were, 5 years ago and kind of went semi-retired, I was very keen to use what time was left to me to really try to get my head under the bonnet, as it were, of some of the things that makes our modern world work. And at the heart of what makes our modern world work, of course, is money. So what I'm going to do this evening, and I'm going to rush through a lot of slides, for which I apologize, but there's a lot to be said, is to give you a bit of a taste of the history of money, also the geography of money, in fact, as we go through it. And in the course of that, I'm also going to begin to present to you a crystal ball. And I'm going to stretch the meaning of the definition of history, if you'll permit me, in order to give us a glimpse of where money is heading as well. Not only the history, but also what its trajectory is, what its direction of travel. So rather than give you a strict chronology, I'm going to try to give you a bit of insight into money's history by asking and answering three separate questions. First of all, what does money do? Secondly, where does it come from? And where is it going? That's the key question that I think we should all be pondering as we go from the meeting this evening. So what does it do, first of all? Well, let me ask you a rhetorical question. Which of these items has not, at some point in the past, at some place in the world, been used as money? So we have some clamshells, we have some tinned fish, we have some tobacco, we have some poker chips, and we have some stones. Well, the answer is, it's a rhetorical question, they've all been used as money at some point or other in human history, in some part of the world or other. Specifically, in relation to the first of the things that money does, which it offers a means of exchange. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I've got some examples of money here. Here's some cash for you, a 10p piece, no expense spared. And I also happen to have in my pocket a £10 note. Okay, so this is an example of money. And we all know what happens with this kind of thing. We go into a shop, we see something we want, an item which is useful to us, and in exchange for that, if we're old school, like I like to be, we give a bit of cash. Or if we're a bit sort of highfalutin and modern about it all, we wave one of these. And if I had such a thing as a smartphone, we might even use that. But even if we're exchanging a bit of paper or a bit of metal or simply electrons down a bit of wire, we are exchanging money for an item or a service which is useful to us. So that's the first function of money. It acts as a means of exchange, a way in which I can get something useful by exchanging it for some money, right? So it's obvious. It's obvious, really, isn't it? So just very quickly, when were these different items used as money? Well, clamshells, or wampum, were used in North America as legal tender for payments of up to £2 between 1535 and 1661, though the last factory drilling shells and putting them on strings, because he used to carry them around on strings, very handy, didn't close until 1860. And pouches of mackerel, or macks as they're commonly known apparently, are used in US prisons as informal money to pay for haircuts, to settle gambling debts. I dread to think for what else. And they did used to use cigarettes, of course, up until 2004, when that got banned for some kind of highfalutin health reasons, I imagine. Tobacco, though, was used as legal tender in the states of Virginia and Maryland in the US from 1642 for about almost 200 years. You could actually take some tobacco and use that as money for buying stuff with. And depositors were charged for keeping their tobacco money, not in banks as we know them today, but in warehouses where it would deteriorate anyway, because tobacco, they tell me, doesn't keep, so which encourages you to spend it, which is good for the economy, isn't it? Or you could smoke it, of course. So that also is a useful, in this instance, a particular side effect of this form of money. And poker chips, or to be more accurate, porcelain counters from local gambling houses, were used as money in some cities in 19th century Siam, or Thailand as it's now called. And if one of these casinos went bust, it would send a town crier around to announce that anyone holding its chips had up to 3 days to redeem them. But you could take them into a shop and use these chips wherever you wanted to buy whatever items you had in mind. And finally, and most intriguingly for me, these disc-shaped stones, which are known locally as fei, were used as currency in the Yap group of islands in the Central Pacific up until the 1960s. And these stones were not local, they were quarried on islands hundreds of miles away. And they were shaped into different sizes, different denominations, as it were, so equivalent to a 50-pence piece and a 10-pence piece and so forth. And they could vary in size, and this is hard to believe, but they could vary in size from being the size of a saucer to, as you can see here, the size of a millstone. And they were so big, and the reason they had a hole through the middle of these larger stones is you could stick a stick through them, and you could actually wheel them along like a wheelbarrow to take them to the shop, to wherever you were going to actually exchange them for whatever very large item, I guess in that case, you were purchasing. Okay, so that was the first question. So money takes many, many different forms and has done historically. That's the first thing to bear in mind as a means of exchange. So here's the second question for you. I'm going to ask for a show of hands here as well, so do pay attention. What units did the accountants of Homer's day use? Homer, of course, the great Greek poet, lived in the 8th century BC. In this country, we use pounds. That's our unit of account. Over the channel, they use the euro. In the States, obviously, they use the dollar. So what unit did the accountants of Homer's day use? Was it the first item here, which is the drachma? Was it heads of iron axes? Was it heads of cattle? Or was it golden fleeces? Hands up if you think it was the drachma. Oh. How about the iron axes? Any takers for the heads of iron axes? Thank you. We were into the Iron Age by then, so very reasonable answer. Heads of cattle, anybody? Think that the heads of cattle were used as the unit of account? No takers for that. Therefore, I assume you all think it was golden fleeces. Well, the answer was heads of cattle. That was the unit of account that was used back in 8th century Greece. Now, there's no evidence that cattle were generally used as means of exchange, as were the clamshells and the tobacco pouches we just looked at. In other words, you didn't have to turn up in a shop with a cow, in tow to exchange for the can of beans or whatever you're going to buy, but rather they simply provided a way of keeping account of who had bought what, and even more importantly, who owed how much to whom. So this is the second use of money as a unit of account. Because it's essentially an abstract quantity, absolutely anything can be used as a unit of account. Because it's a bookkeeping device, essentially, enabling people to keep track of what's been bought and sold and who owes how much to whom. And it also enables people to compare the relative value of qualitatively different things. Now, it's proverbial, isn't it, that there are no two things in the world more different than chalk and cheese. And yet, I can go out, I can buy £3.50 worth of cheese, as I did today when I went up to the Co-op in Ludlow. Or I could go into a stationer's and I could buy, I presume, £3.50's worth of chalk as well. Because the thing about a unit of account is it's just a number. It's sheer quantity. And so it's what Aristotle called the middle term, he said, for it measures all things. It's almost like a kind of financial Esperanto. You can translate anything, regardless of how qualitatively different those things are, into a single number. And that number is the unit of account that you're putting to use, whatever that unit account happens to be. It could be a pound, it could be a dollar, it could be a head of cattle, it could be whatever you want it to be. And back in 1750-ish BC, the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, which is in the Middle East, sort of modern-day Iraq, around there, shows that money was originally just an accountancy system, which was created in order to keep track of resources and to record debts, who owed how much to whom. And although silver was held in the royal treasury, it seldom changed hands. So in general, what people did instead was they ran up tabs, which were denominated in silver in this case, but settled up at harvest time, not through payment in silver, but in barley or anything else which the creditor was willing to accept. I don't know if any of you come across as well some research by a historian called Craig Muldrew, who's looked into economic transactions in 16th and 17th century England. Extraordinary work, meticulous work. He's been through all kinds of records to do this. And what he reckons is that in most towns and villages up and down the land during that period, the 16th and the 17th centuries, coinage was in very, very short supply at times, particularly small change. So basically everybody was always running up tabs against everybody else. Everybody was basically buying and selling something, however trivial. And actual physical currency, like this, and like this, seldom changed hands. But rather what instead happened was every 6 months or a year, everybody in the village would gather together, like everybody in Lane Twydyn would gather together, and there would be a grand reckoning of who owed how much to whom. And of course, many of the debts would cancel out in gross, or in net rather. So anything that was left over at the end was settled either in cash or again in kind, depending on what the creditor was willing to accept. Now, this is a very important point. The credit-debt relationship was therefore the earliest form of economic transaction. It wasn't barter. People often think it was barter, the simultaneous exchange of one item for another, which was how we initially started economic transactions between each other. It was the forerunner of money. But as David Graeber writes, and by the way, I do commend this to you, David Graeber, he's passed away now, he's an American anthropologist. He wrote a book about 15 years ago, which was enormously influential. It's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. It sold millions of copies around the world. I keep going back to this book. I can't commend it too strongly to you. And one of the things that Graeber observes is that we didn't begin with barter, then discover money, and then eventually develop credit systems. It happened precisely the other way around. Barter has mainly been what people who are used to cash transactions do when, for one reason or another, they have no access to currency. So money, and this is a crucial definition, is fundamentally a claim on wealth. It's not wealth itself. It's a social claim on wealth. If you were Robinson Crusoe and you're on a desert island and you had a treasure chest full of Spanish doubloons and, you name it, it would be of absolutely no use to you. If that's all you had, you'd be dead within a few days. Wealth is the stuff that keeps us alive, that keeps us warm, that keeps us well-fed, that does nice things for us that we want to happen. And money is a social claim, a claim on other people to give us wealth. So it's an IOU. That is essentially what money is. Okay, let's move on to another question. What weight of sterling silver do you think you could have bought for a pound in money, in 1900? I'll give you 4 options again here. Could you have bought a pound of sterling silver, do you think? Or maybe 4 pounds? Maybe 4 ounces? Or maybe you couldn't have bought any at all? Well, the answer is, I'm going to crash on here, 4 ounces. And the reason for that is quite interesting. Because originally, you might have thought logically, it should be a pound of silver, shouldn't it, for a pound in money? And originally, you'd have been right. Back in the 8th century, 240 silver pennies together weighed exactly 1 pound in weight. And if you're as old as me, you will remember that in old money, it was 12 pence to a shilling, and of course, 20 shillings to a pound. That's how that works out. But the silver content of these pennies was debased over the course of time. In other words, people started mixing in bits of copper and tin with the silver in order to kind of save a few bob, because copper and tin was far more plentiful than silver. So 4 ounces of sterling silver to the pound was set as the standard exchange rate by Queen Elizabeth II. The first, I should say, in 1560. And remarkably, that standard lasted until World War I, which is a record. In other words, you could go into a bank and you could present a pound in currency, and you could ask them to give you 4 ounces of silver, sterling silver, in return. And that was despite the fact that the actual silver content of a pound in coinage varied hugely during that period. And by the way, in case you're wondering, the modern pound coin, I'm afraid, has no silver in it at all. It's mainly copper. Metallic coinage goes back to, they reckon, about 600 BC. Do you remember, back in ancient Mesopotamia, money as an accountancy system, a way of keeping track of who owes how much to whom, goes way back to about 1800 BC. So metallic coinage is relatively new. It's a new kid on the block. And it emerged in 3 different places around the world, more or less simultaneously, by a curious coincidence. In China, in northern India, on the Gangetic Plain, but also in the city-states that surrounded the Aegean Sea, so modern-day Greece and Turkey. And since then, silver and gold have been favoured choices for coinage because they satisfy what is the third function of money, which is to act as a store of value. The supply of precious metals obviously is limited, which means that gold and silver coins tend to hold their value. And unlike the tobacco used in Virginia or the grain, for example, that was used in ancient Egypt as money, precious metals do not go bad. They don't spoil, which means that I can accumulate money over the course of time, secure in the knowledge that I have only the thief and the taxman to fear. And there is a picture of the Lydian lion from around about 600 BC, which is made of one of these early coins, which is made of electrum, which I'd not come across before, which is an alloy, apparently, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. So let's just sum up where we've got to so far. 3 functions of money, 3 things that money does. It acts as a means or a medium of exchange. It acts as a unit of account, a way of keeping tabs on who owes how much to whom. And it acts as a store of value. So where does it come from? Where does money come from? Well, hold on to your hats. Because I'm going to ask you another question now. And again, I'll ask for a show of hands here if you're feeling brave. When a bank makes a loan, like your bank, whoever you bank with, when it makes a loan, where does that money come from? Does it come from money that's been deposited in the bank by other people? Does it come from money that's been lent to the bank by the Bank of England? Is it a dividend, part of the dividends from Queen Anne's bounty, which was a sum of money invested by Queen Anne in the East India Company way back? Or is it created out of thin air? Deposited in the bank by the people? Any takers for that? Yeah, got a few for that. What about money lent to the bank by the Bank of England? 1 or 2 takers for that. Queen Anne's bounty? Created out of thin air.
Is it a sort of mix?
It isn't a sort of mix. It is all created out of thin air by the commercial bank that has generated that loan. I told you to hold on to your hats, didn't I? Now, the roots of this practice, let me give you a bit of history, because that's what you're interested in. Let me take you back to the 17th century again. That was a crucially important time in the history of money. Now, the roots of this practice of loaning money that you don't actually have goes back to the goldsmiths in London, who became very significant figures because people in those days, they used to deposit their gold and silver, their valuables, with the goldsmiths, because the goldsmiths had proper vaults to keep them safe in. And they would, pay a fee for doing that. And the goldsmiths, in return, would issue them a deposit receipt, an IOU. So when you wanted to get your pocket watch back or your coinage back, you just take a deposit receipt to the goldsmith and they'd give you your valuables back. three really important things followed from this. The first was that over the course of time, people began to accept the deposit receipts, which were IOUs effectively, as a form of cash or means of exchange in everyday purchases. Do you remember when we used to have endorsed checks? You know, if you endorsed a check, you could use that as cash, couldn't you, really? Well, exactly the same way, these deposit receipts started to circulate amongst people in lieu of the coinage which those deposit receipts represented. And secondly, the goldsmiths, who were canny people, realized that they had all this gold and silver coinage sitting in their vaults doing nothing. They thought to themselves, why don't I start loaning some of that stuff out on interest? It's because I'll be doing myself a favor, and I'll be doing whoever borrows the money a favor as well. So they started to loan out the money that had been deposited with them, not making too much of a fuss about it, but making it known that the money was available at interest. And this third step was the really crucial one. Finally, the goldsmiths also realized that since their deposit receipts, their IOUs, were now being widely used as cash, borrowers would be prepared to accept loans issued in the form of these receipts, rather than insisting on gold or silver coinage. And as a result, goldsmiths were able to issue receipts for more coinage than they actually held in their vaults. Do you get that? Now, if you're thinking, isn't that fraud? You're right. They were technically committing fraud. But they kind of got away with it. And generally speaking, people weren't bothered because provided they trusted the goldsmith, in other words, they believed that if they went to the goldsmith tomorrow and they could recoup their deposit receipt for the appropriate amount of gold and silver coinage, they were happy. It was all about trust, trusting in the goldsmith and trusting that not everybody would turn up on the same day asking to cash in their deposit receipts, because if that happened, literally, that would have been the end of the story. So this is the origin of what's known as fractional reserve banking, at least in the UK, which is the practice of lending out more money, effectively in the form of IOUs, than you actually hold. And this extra money is created out of thin air. Banks, which are the present-day equivalents of the goldsmiths, effectively do have a license to print money. So, for example, you remember the 2008 great financial crash? When that happened, it's been estimated that UK commercial banks held only £1.25 in central bank reserves for every £100 loaned out to customers. That is a lot of what they call in the trade leverage, right? Most of that money did not exist in terms of money that they actually held in their own reserves at the Bank of England. So if everybody had turned up to say, can we have this money, you know, you could have gone to a cash point, and this very nearly happened. You know, the whole system very nearly collapsed in 2008. And whatever you think of it, you know, if it wasn't for Gordon Brown and a few other people around the world who stepped in to initiate a rescue package, society would have collapsed, because you'd have gone into a shop, you'd have waved a bit of plastic in front of the machine, transaction rejected. You'd have gone to the cash point and punched in your number. No money would have come out, because the whole financial system would have basically solidified. So this is extraordinary. Now, this isn't the only graph I'm going to show you. I know some people are kind of, they're not very comfortable with graphs, so I'm going to quickly whiz through this. But I think this just illustrates the extent to which this creation of money out of nothing has actually been happening over the course, particularly of the last 40 or 50 years. So this is, on the x-axis here, we've got time, we're 1963 through to the present. And let me just take you through what these lines are. So I've standardized all these. So all these measures equal 100 back at the beginning of 1963. So what I'm trying to show you here is how these different measures have increased over the course of the last, how long it is, 62 years, something like that, 63 years. So the blue line at the bottom, do you see that? That's inflation. That's the retail price index. And as you can see, that's increased from 100 through to about, it's increased by a factor of 33 during that time. As we know, things have got more expensive over the last 60 years, haven't they? The yellow line just above it is the amount of cash in circulation. Now that's notes and coins, good old-fashioned cash. And as you can see, that's pretty much kept pace with inflation, hasn't it? The amount of cash actually circulating in the economy. The next thing to look at is the green line. Now that is UK gross domestic product. So the way to think about that is, if the whole of the country was one household, GDP would be the annual income of that household. Okay? Now, there's all kinds of problems, actually, with GDP as a measure of true prosperity, but we'll just take it as an index of that. And as you can see, that's increased far more rapidly than the amount of cash in circulation and also faster than inflation, right? The other thing that's more or less kept pace with it is that purple line, and that's the Nationwide Building Society House Price Index. Because as you will have noticed, houses have got a lot more expenses as well, relatively, over the course of time. They've appreciated in value much more quickly than inflation, but they've more or less kept pace with GDP. But the reason I'm showing you this is because of the red line, because that is the amount of commercial bank money that is in circulation in the economy. And look how that's increased compared to what it was back in 1963. It's increased, by my calculations, by a factor of 278, and it dwarfs everything else. And if you looked at that more closely in a more granular way, you'd have seen those lines were actually quite close together up until about 1980, 85, and then suddenly they started to diverge. This was the great financialization of the economy which took place in the 1980s in this country and in other places too. Now, all that money that's been created by commercial banks, by your bank and by my bank, is interest-bearing debt. And if we were all to repay our debts tomorrow, if everyone was to repay our debts, all that money would disappear. And you may say, and there's a sense in which you could argue, therefore, that the gap there between the amount of money in circulation and where GDP is, as it were, excess money, because it's money that doesn't really represent anything beyond itself. If money is a claim on wealth, then most of the money that's been created has nothing in the real world corresponding to it. It's just being created and it's circulating through my bank account and your. Now, you and I may never have borrowed a cent in our lives, or if we have, then we've repaid that money. Nevertheless, the money that's in our commercial bank accounts is money that somebody borrowed at some point in the past, which has not yet been repaid. And interest is being paid on it, or should be being paid on it, by somebody somewhere. Now, if you're shocked by that, you wouldn't be the first to be shocked by it. So somebody called LLB Angus, who was an investment advisor, said this: the modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. And J.K. Galbraith, who was an economic advisor to John Kennedy, said, the process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled. And I'm not sure whether he actually said this, but it's commonly attributed to him. Henry Ford, the man who gave us the motor car, said this: it is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. So, Philip Coggan is a financial journalist, and I don't know if you have any of you ever listened to Start the Week on Radio 4 on a Monday morning. I don't know if it's still on. It used to be. When I used to have Mondays as my day off when I was in the parish, so I used to listen to him as I drove around the place. He did a brilliant interview back in 2012, and this is part of what he said. Over the last 40 years, he said, we've had no constraints on the creation of money by commercial banks, and it has all been used to buy assets. So we've had this series of bubbles in which borrowed money has been used to buy houses, shares, whatever, assets of different kinds. And every time the result has been that the finance sector has expanded very rapidly. So Wall Street, the financial sector, City of London, we could equally say, now depends on the central bank, on the Bank of England in this country, to prop up asset markets and keep prices high. This is the key quote. We've created more claims on wealth than we have created wealth itself. And that is the problem. And we're not going to pay these debts back. There's no way those debts are going to be paid back. So what are the options? Well, there are two options, basically. First of all, a default on debt. That would involve the collapse of various asset markets, whether that's the stock market or house prices or you name it. and it would cash out, literally, in terms of you going to the cash point, typing in your number, nothing coming out. Or inflation, which is basically inflation isn't so much things getting more expensive, it's more about money losing its purchasing power. And that could manifest itself as consumer price inflation, the prices of things going up in the shops, or as in asset inflation, which is the stock markets around the world still going crazily into the stratosphere, or the prices of property continuing to rise. And I do like this quote, the choice between default and inflation, says somebody called Fabio Vighi, is a choice between bleeding to death and suffering a heart attack. The option is yours. One way or another, something negative will happen. So the Bank of England plays a key role in the origins of this extraordinary system that we have come to take for granted. And it all had to do with something that happened in 1694, when a group of wealthy merchants lent King William III of England, you may remember he'd just been imported by a bunch of well-to-do people from Holland, which we'd been at war with, not once, not twice, but 3 times in the course of the previous decades, to be the new king. They'd kicked out James II. Do you remember that? Well, they just imported William III and his wife Mary to be the new monarchs of this country. And William wanted to go to war against the French. Basically, this country was at war continually, pretty much throughout the 17th century, against all comers. So the Dutch, certainly, but also the Spanish, which was traditional, and the French, which was becoming a new thing at that time. But he was desperately short of money. So what happened was a group of wealthy merchants lent him £1.2 million, which was a lot of money back then, to spend on war against France at 8% interest per annum. And in return, the king's creditors were allowed to create their own private bank, which had unique public privileges. And that is and remains the Bank of England. And this is David Graeber talking again. The investors received a royal monopoly on the issuance of banknotes. And what this meant in practice was they had their right to advance IOUs for a portion of the money the king now owed them to any inhabitant of the kingdom willing to borrow from them. And this sounds a bit of a crazy thing to do, but this was the business model, or indeed willing to deposit their own money in the bank. So in effect, what happened was the newly created royal debt was monetized and went into circulation around the economy. And if we had more time, I would talk you through this really interesting diagram of how the system worked. But these 2 quotes, I think, are key. So Ryan Collins and his co-authors describe this as the integration of the state and its creditor class. And David Graeber comments that paper money, which is this, was debt money. It was created as a portion of the king's debt. And it was war money, because that's what he needed the money for. And this has always been the case. Historically, states have gone seriously into debt when they've gone to war. That's always when they need money. That's always when they're prepared to cut corners in order to get more cash. And what made this at all a viable system was this piece here. The taxable income that was drawn from the general population. Without that bit of circuit in the diagram, the system would have collapsed. Because the king's creditors were confident enough that the government could raise, on a regular, predictable basis, enough money in taxation from the general population in order to be able to pay their 8% per annual interest, plus the management fees they were charging. So the taxation piece here is absolutely critical, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So anyway, as I said, that's why it says on your good old-fashioned £10 note, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. Because basically, again, it's an IOU from the central bank, from the Bank of England in this case. And the money that you've got in your commercial bank accounts, which I've got in my commercial bank account, is essentially an IOU from the commercial bank to me. Now, whether that IOU will get honoured is a debatable question. And back in 2007, 2008, they very nearly didn't. So here's a picture from the turn of the 18th century, at the time of the South Sea Bubble, which you may have heard about, which was, again, essentially the late 17th, early 18th century was a time of huge financial innovation, and all kinds of new schemes for making money were doing the rounds there. And Charles Davenant, who was a one-time Tory MP for St Ives, wrote in a pamphlet that these gimcracks and new devices of funds and stocks and exchequer bills and malt and lottery tickets, they've turned the brains of a great part of the city. There is not such a thing left as public spirit, and in its room we have set up knavery, extortion, and self-interest. If that rings any bells, then it's a bell that's been ringing for quite a long time. So money, just to kind of reinforce this point, is just a social claim on future wealth. It's not wealth itself. That's why it can take the form of a piece of paper, or of a stone, as we've seen, or a clamshell, or increasingly these days, just a number which is stored on a computer somewhere, something as ephemeral as that. Now, I mentioned tax a moment ago, and taxation has been a major source of revenue for rulers throughout human history. And whereas way back a local landowner might have accepted a portion of the tenant's harvest as a tithe, a distant emperor might well prefer tribute in coinage. And this led conquerors to impose a cash economy on the inhabitants of conquered lands in order to expedite the payment of tax. And this is what's known as the state theory of money, or chartalism, which defines money as whatever the state will accept as tax payment. So the Bank of England's promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5 or whatever means the government promises to accept this £5 note as partial settlement of your tax bill. But of course, have any of us come across local currencies at all? If you were living in Bristol up until a few years ago when the whole scheme fell over, you might have come across this item down on the bottom right-hand corner here, which is a Bristol pound. It's a local currency which was very much a bottom-up creation of some people in Bristol. And the idea is that these notes were used to expedite financial transactions, particularly among sections of the community who were financially disadvantaged, who didn't have access to, £10 notes of this kind. And and here's a Lewis pound. Lewis in Sussex has also had a very flourishing local currency system, which has been created by local people. There are such things called time banks as well, where basically you essentially exchange units of time and services with each other. Local currencies like this have sprung up time and time again over the course of history, particularly when local communities are hard-pressed financially, and they've proved to be a lifesaver. And this was true, not least, in 1920s Germany, when hyperinflation had devastated the value of the official national currency, the Reichsmark. Businesses had gone bust all over the place, and so a lot of these local currencies started to spring up, including this one here called the Währer, which was introduced in a place called Schwannenkirchen in Germany in the 1920s. And it proved very popular. And it enabled the local coal mine to reopen, and it totally revitalized the local economy. This was a local currency that was being generated by a bunch of local businessmen. They just set it up amongst themselves. And it began to be adopted further afield, with more than 2,000 businesses in the end across Germany using the Währer as a means of exchange. You might think that that was a good thing, and everybody will be happy, but you'd be wrong, because the German central bank came to see the Währer and other local currencies like it as a threat to the status of the national currency, the Reichsmark. And as a result, the local currencies, they were all declared illegal in 1931. So money is whatever the state says it is, whatever the state allows it to be. And if we had longer, we would do a Bible study right now. We would look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, where Jesus was asked, is it right, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? Because what was going on here, and empires across history have done this, is they've imposed their own money on provinces that they've conquered in order to be able to channel the productive capacities of that province, of that part of the world, back to the imperial hub. It's happened time and time again. It happened during the British Empire as well, in droves where hut taxes were imposed, for example, on people in West Africa and so forth. It's a classic ruse. And again, what it shows is that money in a developed economy is very much tied up with the power of the state. And of course, the state need not insist that you pay your taxes in gold and silver coinage. It could choose anything it likes for you as a medium. So it could, for example, print and distribute its own IOUs and insist the tax be paid with them. And this is an example of what they call a fiat money system, in which a government declares a particular currency which is not backed by any physical commodity to be legal tender. Now, from 1945 through to 1971, we had something called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which basically said that the US dollar could be exchanged for 35 ounces of gold, and that the exchange rates between the pound or the franc or the Deutschmark or anything else, they were all related on a fixed basis to the value of the dollar. Now, that was the latest version of something called the International Gold Standard, where the value of your local currency effectively translated into a weight of gold. You may remember that President Nixon came off the gold standard in August of 1971. Why did he do that? Because the US had been spending money it didn't have on a war in Vietnam. And as exactly the same situation that William of Orange was in back in the 17th century, he needed essentially more money. So he had to, because there was only so much gold in the world, he had to decouple the value of the dollar from any amount of gold. He completely decoupled it. And consequently, we've been living in this strange floating world ever since, where money has been essentially decoupled from the value of anything substantial and physical. So this diagram just summarizes how all this fits in together. So money is an IOU. It's a social relation between people, and it's a claim on wealth, on useful things like food and clothing and shelter and heating and stuff that we can actually make use of. But it also has this political dimension in an advanced economy. Money is also whatever the government will accept as tax, whatever the government says money can be. How are we doing, Ralph?
Another few minutes.
Another few minutes. Well, sounds like precious little time. I would love to talk to you about the petrodollar, which is, again, we haven't got time to do that, but it's a really clever thing that Henry Kissinger came up with as a way of keeping the US as top country after they come off the gold standard. The thing about the petrodollar is two things. First of all, it's enabled America to become, by a country mile, the most indebted country ever in the history of the world. $38 trillion in debt. That's how indebted the American government is. And they're able to get away with that because everybody needs dollars to buy oil, or at least they have up until now, because as you may have noticed, the world is becoming multipolar, and not necessarily in a good way. The yuan is the Chinese currency. Increasingly, oil trades are being made in non-dollar currencies. And that is threatening the whole world order that we're caught up in. I haven't got time to go into that. The other two things I wanted to mention were shadow banking. There's a lady here called Anne Pettifor, who's a kind of economics expert. And she's very concerned about things called shadow banks. Now, these include pension funds and hedge funds and insurance companies. They act a bit like banks, but they're not subject to the same regulations as commercial banks are, which means a bit like a pawnbroker might take a gold watch from you and lend you some money in exchange. Effectively, what they tend to do is they then take that gold watch and they go to another bigger pawnbroker and they say, can I leave this with you? And can you give me some more money in exchange for that so I can then use it to expand my business and then to more people? And then the second pawnbroker then takes it to a third pawnbroker and says, well, can we give you this gold watch? And can we borrow some more money from you? So essentially the same piece of collateral, the same security, ends up being multiply leveraged with all kinds of different amounts of credit being generated by what initially was simply one gold watch. So she's very concerned that this is going to mean there's going to be a big crash in the system very soon. And I haven't got time to go through this. Have any of you seen the film The Big Short? Yes, The Big Short, it appears sometimes, doesn't it, on BBC iPlayer, I've noticed. Do try to catch it. I think it's the best film that's been made about the 2008 great financial crash. And there's a very famous scene in it where this lady here called Selena Gomez, who I think is a famous singer, she and a Nobel Prize-winning economist are gathered around a roulette table in Las Vegas, and they explain, in very simple terms, how financial derivatives work. And again, basically, it's basically, as Ellen Brown, who's a financial commentator, said, it's just a way of betting on the future. These derivatives, or weapons of financial mass destruction, as Warren Buffett called them, played a key role in the destabilization that happened in 2008. And these derivatives are still very much with us. So that you see these in this graph here. Nobody knows, by the way, the value of these derivatives, but they're here, the two right-hand columns. It's something between, in 2022, they estimated between $600 and $1,000 trillion worth of derivatives. Gross world product, that's the total annual income of the whole world, is less than $100 trillion. The shadow banks have got about 200 or 250 trillion dollars under management. I mean, if suddenly that system broke down, the whole house of cards would come tumbling down with it, unless something quite extraordinary happened to stop that happening. So another way of imagining this is as an inverted pyramid. And at the bottom here, we've got land, right? Land is wealth. And by land, I mean not just kind of soil and earth, I mean the whole biosphere of which we're part, on which our life depends. And from that, we extract commodities, things that are practically useful to us, which we can buy and sell. Now, all that is wealth. Everything else is claims on wealth. And there's a kind of hierarchy of security here. So the most secure thing you can have is cash. Don't know if you remember back in 2007, pictures on the news of investors with Northern Rock Bank queuing up outside to get their money out. What they were wanting to do was to convert their commercial bank money, which they'd completely lost trust in, because they lost trust in the bank, into the Bank of England's money, which looks like this. So that's what I mean by cash. Then you have government bonds. That's the next less secure form of money, essentially IOUs from governments. They tend to be fairly secure, and the UK government has yet to renege on any of the bonds that it's issued. You then have commercial bank deposits and pension funds. Every single penny that you and I have got in our bank comes under that heading there. That's a commercial bank deposit, and it is significantly less secure than cash or indeed government bonds. You then have commercial bonds. Basically, those are IOUs that have been issued by any old company to borrow money. They're pretty insecure, depending on which firm you're talking about. And finally, you've got these derivatives that I've just mentioned, these massively leveraged bets on how particular commodities will behave in the future, plus also things like unsecured domestic debt. Now, if this looks precarious to you, mightn't this just topple over one day if there was a slight gust of wind? It absolutely could. And this is where we're at, which is why we have to ask the question, where is money going? Some of you may have heard of the phrase, the Great Reset. The Great Reset is an idiom that was popularized by a guy called Klaus Schwab, who was the chief executive of the World Economic Forum 10 years ago now. Basically, a lot of people are wise to the fact that this system has run up against its sell-by date, and something new is going to have to take its place. And one of the elements of this new system is something called central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. And up until now, about 154 countries around the world are actively involved in exploring the introduction of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, but only a couple so far have actually implemented them. So what is a CBDC? Well, basically, I just need to it's a new fourth kind of money, because although it's all in this country, it's all denominated in pounds, there are currently three different sorts of money. Then they're a bit like oil and water. They don't mix, right? So the first kind of money is physical cash, which we're familiar with. The second kind of money is digital money that lives in a computer somewhere, which is essentially reserves held by the Bank of England, created by the Bank of England and held for the government, but also for the commercial banks, okay? the money that you and I have got in our bank accounts then has been created by a commercial bank and exists as a deposit for us. Those are the three kinds of money that currently exist. Now, a CBDC would be another kind of money that the Bank of England creates for individuals and companies, which will, so for the first time ever, ordinary people like you and I will be able to have an account at the Bank of England. We couldn't do that before. Only commercial banks and the government had that facility previously. And that these accounts won't directly deal with the Bank of England, it'll be via an agent. Sometimes they're called digital wallets. And potentially, the money in those accounts could be distributed via something called a universal basic income. So these are some likely initial features of a CBDC, and this is all from recent Bank of England publications. So CBDC will be account-based rather than token-based. In other words, it's not going to be issued as a token. It's going to be more like the money that you transact when you wave your card in front of a machine or when you wave your smartphone. It's account-based. And what that means is that everybody who's got one of these accounts will need to have personal digital identification. Okay? So in this country, during World War II, everyone was given an identity card to show who you were and where you lived and all the rest of it. And those cards actually were still valid up until they were repealed in 1952. And one of the reasons they were repealed was Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister again by that time, says, "I don't think this identity card business is very British, do you? It sounds a little bit like the kind of thing the Nazis would have done, so we're doing away with those." Well, digital ID would be exactly like that, except on steroids, because you'd be connected up to a massive computer network, which would potentially enable anyone who had access to your information to track every single movement that you were performing every day, every single financial transaction that you were involved with. So these CBDC customer accounts would be managed by existing commercial banks, NatWest, Lloyds, or whatever, or possibly by some independent payment service providers, which will get set up. So they will be the front end, which we would directly deal with. We wouldn't directly deal with the Bank of England. CBDC will enter circulation reactively in response to demand and via commercial banks, very much as cash does now. And the Bank of England's very clear about this. They don't want to replace cash at this point. Neither do they want to enter into competition with commercial banks. So they want all this to be like a mixed ecology of different kinds of money floating around at the same time. And what's interesting is that these accounts could very easily be interest-bearing, and this would include a negative interest rate. So, for example, if you had £1,000 in your CBDC account, that might attract 1% interest. The next £1,000, from £1,000 to £2,000, would be interest-free. But potentially, they could then put a negative interest rate on any money above £2,000 that you held in that account. Now, why would they do that? Well, again, they don't want to crowd commercial banks out of business. Because, if we were to, as we will eventually, I suspect, hit another financial crash, the safest place to have your money is going to be in the Bank of England. And, of course, the commercial banks, your NatWest, your Lloyds, your whoever else, they're terrified of the fact that suddenly everyone's going to take their money out of their accounts and stick it in their CBDC accounts. So at the moment, the Bank of England want to deter people from doing that by attaching negative interest rates, potentially, this is all up in the air still, on anything beyond a certain threshold. And this observation, I think, is key. The ability of the central bank to control the impact of a CBDC on the monetary system is paramount to its existence. So there's also pros and cons to CBDCs. Let me give you a couple of quotes, at least, to give you a flavor of those. So Joseph Huber, Emeritus Professor of Economic Sociology in Germany, who's been arguing for this kind of thing for a long time, says, despite foreseeable frictions, introducing CBDC is a step in the right direction. He thinks it's a good thing too. The House of Lords did a report a couple of years ago. They're not so persuaded. They're not so persuaded about the values of a CBDC. We have yet to hear a convincing case for why the UK needs a retail CBDC. And this gentleman here, Fabio Vighi, Professor of Critical Theory at Cardiff University, says digital cash linked to digital identity is shorthand for high-tech monetary serfdom, which will be extended to the unemployed first, those who are receiving universal basic income, but potentially to most of us. And when Larry Fink, who is the chief executive officer of BlackRock, which is basically an investment firm which handles all our pensions, or a large portion of our pensions, when he says that markets prefer totalitarian governments to democracies, we should better believe him. So where's the faith in all that? Let me bring this to a close. Faith runs through this, through the way money works, like, Blackpool through a stick of rock. So in what ways? Well, first of all, with money, we have faith in something that doesn't yet exist. The kind of money that we've had since the 17th century has been based on wealth that has not yet been produced, because it's generated as interest-bearing debt. And ultimately, it reflects faith that your money will be there when you want it. Those people who turned up to queue outside Northern Rock for their cash back in 2007, they weren't at all sure their money would be there when they wanted it. It involves faith that your money can be exchanged for useful things. Can you take it down the shop and actually give it to somebody and they'll give you a loaf of bread in exchange? It reflects faith in a system which is based on endless interest-bearing debt. We're not going to pay these debts back, as that financial commentator observed. Increasingly, it reflects faith in really, really arcane financial innovations which have been created over the last 40 or 50 years. And I suspect quite soon it will involve faith that a central bank digital currency won't lead to a totalitarian dystopia where Big Brother is watching you from all angles. And if you start misbehaving according to whatever criteria might be in place at that time for good and misbehavior, then they will know all about it. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Because, and I think this is really very relevant, because our ultimate loyalties and commitments aren't supplementary to mundane acts of faith and trust, the kind of acts that we do all the time when we transact money, but they're rather expressed through them. That's the key thing to notice. And that is the end of my sermon, beyond shamelessly advertising the book, which God willing will be coming out later in the summer. The cover design may not look like this. I found this on the internet. I thought it was such a brilliant picture. I must suggest it to my publishers. They'll probably go with something else. It's called Maximum Power. It's not mainly about money, though money does appear in it. It's about the way money, power works in societies, but also in the world of stuff. So it's about what's, power in terms of what's, as well as power in terms of the way we get each other to do things that we want the other person to do. And tries to make some connections there, looks at the differences, and asks the fundamental question of where does trust, where does faith feature in all of that? Thank you for bearing with me for so long.
Thanks very much, John. As an accountant, I feel decidedly lightheaded after listening to that. Anyway, we have time for a few questions, so if anybody would like to ask a question, Jonathan, can I ask you to use the mic? We'll do Jonathan first, just for a change.
You talk about faith.
Yes.
Basically, as we move towards digital currency,
Yes.
Should faith really be lodged in the continuance of water and electricity?
Yes. Yes, so the basics that we've taken for granted, or come to take for granted over the course of the last century or so, which is basic utilities like power, like water, clean water, like an effective sewerage system. I think it's helpful to remember, I don't know how many of us have actually lived in parts of what we used to call the third world, but most of the population of this planet cannot take these things for granted even now. And as we move into a period of increasing resource scarcity, which I think we're absolutely beginning to do, that is going to impact on the financial system in ways that are going to be very destabilizing. And we will learn the value of some of the basic wealth, like clean water, that we've come to take for granted over the course of that time. And I think that part of the thinking behind CBDCs is it's a kind of like a backstop that the government wants to put into place, such that as and when the larger financial system does keel over, a bit like that inverted pyramid, we won't all be rioting saying, why isn't our water supply working anymore? Why doesn't our money work in the shops? Because there will be a fallback in there. And that will teach us, I think, to reevaluate and to learn to appreciate, once again, some of the basics, the basic elements of wealth that have enabled us to live good and worthwhile lives all those years. Hello.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating lecture, thank you. What should we do? Here we are with our few shares, with our ISAs.
Yes.
Should we be pulling those out, turning them into money, using that money to buy tangible assets, perhaps land, perhaps building, whatever, just retaining enough to keep our personal systems ticking over, is my question. One quick comment. When I was a young lad many tens of years ago, in about the 1950s, there used to be a number of department stores. I'm from the northeast, in Gateshead and Newcastle. When you bought anything from them, they actually gave you, using cash, they gave you change in plastic money.
Oh, right.
And that plastic money had a slightly higher value than had you got had you got it in pounds, shillings and pence.
Yes, yes.
But of course you could only, and indeed those tokens were circulated around the community.
Yes, yes.
But you could only, of course, recover the cost. You could only recover them by returning to those shops and buying other products. Now, so it was money, but not widely circulated, but it was circulated.
On a local basis, it was. Yes.
And was it? That seems to have disappeared.
Oh, well.
Maybe it hasn't. Was it legal? Anyhow, two questions. What did we do with our ISAs, and what about the plastic money?
I'll answer them in reverse order. So, do you remember when I mentioned the Vera, that local currency that was introduced in Germany? That's very similar setup to that. Essentially, it's a bottom-up form of money, which is generated by local businesses or local communities. And then until and unless the government stops it, why not use it?
It's legal.
Yeah, absolutely. The government will only notice it if it really begins to take off, and if the government is feeling insecure about its own currency, as the German government did back in 1931. But if you went again, but interesting, in Craig Muldrew's book, basically he says if you went into an English town or a village in the 17th century, that's exactly what you would have seen. The national currency was, even small change was in such short supply. There's a quote here, which I will read you. It's quite amazing. Yes, in the poorer neighbourhoods and cities and large towns, cities and large towns, shopkeepers would issue their own lead, leather, or wooden token money. And in the 16th century, this became something of a fad, it says, with artisans and even poor widows producing their own currency to make ends meet. So, and there's one particular economist called Thomas Greco, who's written books on this, and this is exactly the model of money that he advocates, because he says that the only people who should be allowed to issue money are people who are also generating wealth. So that, exactly as you explained there, although that money might circulate around the economy, eventually it goes back to somewhere where you can recoup that plastic token or wherever it is for something substantial and useful. So again, I'm a big fan of local currencies. I mean, there are quite, as I said, the Bristol pound, I think, was doing very well until COVID happened and nobody was out shopping anymore and the whole system just collapsed. So they're rather fragile local currencies, but I think there's tremendous potential in them in terms of sustaining the integrity and the functioning of local communities when the larger national currency system has gone a bit wobbly. And then the first question is, where should we put our money? Well, wealth is land, ultimately, isn't it? Or it's in resources that are grown from the land. Shall I make a bit of a confession to you? Promise not to tell anybody. But about 3 years ago, I bought some gold You won't tell anybody, will you? Bought some gold. Not actual, paper gold via the Royal Mint. I'm quite pleased I did. I don't know if you know what's happened to the gold price in the last year or so. And silver, exactly the same thing. And these are all indications that something profound is changing in the global financial system. That hard assets are suddenly being priced realistically again after decades when we were living in a kind of never-never world of, remember that red line in the graph? These basically claims on wealth that doesn't exist just going through the roof. And us pretending that was actual, real, concrete stuff that we could make use of. So, but I think, yes, insofar as we do have money at our disposal, I was thinking, I'm seeing my godson for the first time in quite a long time in a few weeks' time. And he's in his 30s now. And I was... I haven't told my wife this yet, so don't tell anybody. But I'm thinking, do you know, because he's a very, very creative young man, theatrical background. He hasn't got two pennies to rub together, I bet you. He didn't inherit much from his mother. And I'm thinking, should I invest in him? I'm genuinely thinking perhaps that's what I should be doing, is maybe finding out what he's doing in his life, what would be useful for him financially to help him through to kind of make a bit of a breakthrough onto the next rung of where he's trying to get to. So investing in people, investing in actual concrete resources that are going to nourish and sustain our lives, I think that's absolutely the way to go.
I wonder if I could come back very quickly about the gold issue.
Oh, yes.
I'm a geologist.
Ah, right.
And in the past, I'm conscious of some of the gold the practices of mining gold in South Africa.
Yes.
Some of the mines are very, very, very deep.
Yeah.
They are so deep that they have rock crushing. They are workers underground who actually have been crushed simply because of the pressure closing up the roadways or the cavities.
Yeah.
So could I say that there is blood in your gold?
Yeah, no, I entirely accept that. It's a very, and I'm afraid if you drive an electric car, there's blood in that cobalt as well. There's in the batteries. Yeah, I'm afraid mining is a horrible, horrible activity, and obviously extractive industries generally. I've got a major ethical question mark against them. But thank you for registering that point. I am rightly chastened by what you've said.
Is there a final question?
There's somebody here, I think.
Let's give you the mic. Thanks.
I'm afraid this is relatively trivial compared with what's just gone before. But a couple of months ago, I went into a bank which was not my own, but was my own in the sense of it was the same bank, but not the same branch. And I wanted to take some money out. And the guy behind the counter said, "What do you want it for?" And I said, "None of your business."
He asked you
and he said, "I'm entitled to ask you because when you put the money in our bank, it becomes ours."
Ah, yes.
And I was absolutely appalled and said, "Well, I want to buy something. Will that do?" And he said, "It's fine." He gave me the money.
How much? I try to think. How much money did you want to take out? For goodness?
I honestly can't remember. It wasn't that much.
The point you've made there, I'm afraid he was right. This sounds completely crazy, but when you put money in the bank, technically it does belong to the bank. They have a legal obligation to surrender it to you when you request. And so I'm surprised he asked you about it. But technically speaking, title to that money lies with them while it's in their possession. It's a point that's made in some various things I've read.
But he does have a legal obligation to give it to me if I ask for it.
Yes, yes, I think.
He did, but I mean...
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
I thought it was a bloody cheat.
Well, absolutely, yeah. Gracious me.
That was all.
You weren't wearing sort of a dark coat and sort of like sunglasses on at the time. And
I was looking my very best.
I've got this theory. Have you noticed all these barbers that have sprung up recently everywhere? Everywhere there's a Turkish barber. It's a massive money laundering operation, isn't it? I mean, there aren't that many people who need their haircut. Anyway, sorry. I think banks are rightly suspicious of what's going on in the world of finance these days.
Thanks so much. We did talk beforehand about whether John was going to take on the role of Martin Lewis tonight and provide specific financial advice. So if you want to collar John afterwards and ask him what shares you should invest in, then I'm sure he will be very pleased to help. Been an absolutely fascinating talk. Could I ask you to thank John in the usual manner, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you ever so much for asking me to come. As you can tell, I'm quite interested in this. I have a PDF of this presentation which has got all links to the sources that I've referenced. So can you see my email address there? jwd@phonecoop.coop. If you ping me an email, I will gladly send you a copy of the presentation. You can chase... This is what I want people to do, to chase up the sources for themselves, make sure I haven't completely misled you this evening, and to begin to explore some of these issues for yourself, because in its own way, there is no more fundamentally important issue around at the moment than the future of money, because it connects up with everything else, doesn't it, that happens in the world. So thank you for turning out, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.